What was female hygiene like in the Wild West? The average frontier woman changed her menstrual rags in full view of her children, washed them in the same basin she'd used for cooking vegetables an hour later, and hung them to dry where ranch hands and boarders could see them. Privacy was not a frontier luxury. It was a fantasy that belonged to a different world entirely. This is the reality Hollywood erased. Every Western you've ever watched showed you saloon girls with perfect hair, pioneer women with clean calico dresses, homesteaders who somehow maintained dignity and cleanliness while conquering a continent. The truth is so much harsher, so much more brutal, that it's been systematically written out of history. Today we're pulling back that curtain using a single object as our lens into this hidden world, the menstrual rag. This piece of repurposed flour sack fabric, roughly 8 inches square, reveals everything about what frontier women actually endured: the labor, the shame, the disease, the impossible choices, and the silence that surrounded it all. Because once you understand what this single object demanded of women, you'll understand why thousands died from infections that started with something as simple as their monthly cycle. You'll understand why the frontier West wasn't won by rugged individuals with guns. It was survived by women who had nothing but cloth scraps between themselves and hemorrhage, infection, and death. Let's start with how a frontier woman obtained these rags in the first place. The rag's creation. A homesteader woman in Wyoming Territory, 1878, sits at her kitchen table, though kitchen is generous for the corner of a one-room sod house where a cast-iron stove occupies 3 square feet. She's tearing apart a flour sack that's been washed, used, rewashed, and patched until the fabric has gone threadbare. The sack itself came from town 40 miles away, carried in a wagon through mud that could swallow a wheel. Nothing is wasted here. Nothing. She rips the fabric into rectangles, roughly the size of her hand. 8 pieces from one sack if she's careful. These will be her menstrual rags for the next 5 years, maybe 10 if they hold up. She's hemming them by candlelight because thread is expensive and raw edges fray too quickly. Her daughter, 11 years old, watches from the corner. Neither speaks. This is how girls learned about menstruation on the frontier, through silent observation, through watching their mothers prepare these rags, through the sudden day when blood appeared and a mother wordlessly handed over a folded square of cloth with instructions whispered in shame. The alternative materials tell their own story. Women use strips torn from old petticoats, the ones so stained and worn they could no longer be seen in public. They used feed sacks stamped with brand names that never fully washed out. They used cotton scraps begged from general stores, bartered for with eggs or butter. Wealthy women in established towns might purchase flannel, but a homesteader wife made do with whatever fabric her family wasn't currently wearing. The preparation itself was labor. Every hem had to be sewn because fraying edges meant lint, irritation, and faster deterioration. Some women quilted multiple layers together for absorbency. Others simply folded the fabric several times. There was no standard, no instruction manual, no shared wisdom beyond what your mother showed you in silence. And if your mother had died in childbirth, as frontier mothers did with horrifying regularity, you figured it out alone. The monthly cycle of shame. When menstruation began, a frontier woman faced an immediate crisis of logistics. She's wearing from skin outward: a chemise, a corset, 2 petticoats, and a dress. The combined weight approaches 20 pounds. The layers are designed for modesty, not convenience. To change a menstrual rag, she must either lift all these layers, impossible while standing, or remove enough clothing to access her undergarments. In a one-room cabin she shares with her husband, 4 children, and possibly a hired hand who sleeps by the stove, there is nowhere private to do this. The outhouse offers privacy from eyes, but not from the elements. In January in Montana Territory, the outdoor privy is a place where exposed skin risks frostbite in minutes. In August in Texas, it's a furnace where flies swarm and the smell of human waste makes breathing difficult. Most women changed their rags behind a hung blanket, a makeshift curtain that fooled no one. The family knew, the boarders knew, the children definitely knew, because children notice everything, and frontier children had no sanitized childhood to protect them from bodily realities. A woman's menstruation was an open secret in every confined frontier space. The rag itself was secured through improvisation. Some women used pins, straight pins that could shift, stab, and tear fabric. Others tied the rag to cloth strips that fastened around the waist, creating a primitive belt system. The rag sat directly against skin, held in place by compression from those 20 pounds of clothing. When it became saturated, and flour sack fabric has limited absorbency, blood soaked through to the chemise, sometimes to the petticoats. Women walked around with blood stains on their undergarments for days, unable to wash them until their period ended, unable to change into fresh clothes that didn't exist. Leaking was constant. During heavy flow days, a woman might need to change rags every 3 to 4 hours, but if she was hauling water from a creek half a mile away, or plowing a field, or cooking for a dozen ranch hands, she couldn't stop every few hours. She bled through. The blood dried. The smell intensified in summer heat, and she kept working because frontier life didn't pause for menstruation. The water crisis. Here's where the menstrual rag reveals the full scope of frontier hygiene nightmares. These rags had to be washed, had to be reused month after month, year after year, because there was no alternative, no disposable option, no possibility of simply throwing them away and cutting new ones from fabric that didn't exist. The average frontier family had access to 2 to 3 gallons of water per day for all purposes, not per person, for the entire family. That water had to cover drinking, cooking, washing dishes, basic hygiene, and laundry. When you're rationing water at that level, every drop has a hierarchy of importance. Drinking water for children comes first, cooking water second, washing dishes third. Personal hygiene falls somewhere near the bottom, and laundering menstrual rags competes with every other desperate need. Women washed their menstrual rags in cold water first, trying to release the blood before it set. This meant standing over a basin, often the same basin used for dishwashing, and scrubbing fabric between her knuckles. The water turned rust red. The smell was iron and meat. In winter, this water might be the only water she'd heat all day, and she'd use it afterward for something else because waste was unthinkable. After the cold rinse, the rags went into a boiling pot if fuel permitted, wood or buffalo chips for the fire, water heated to boiling temperatures, lye soap shaved into the pot. Lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat in a caustic process that left women's hands cracked and bleeding, was harsh enough to strip blood from fabric, but also harsh enough to destroy skin. Women's hands on the frontier were documented as being perpetually raw, split at the knuckles, infected at the nail beds. Laundry was the primary culprit. The boiled rags were then scrubbed on a washboard, wrung out by hand, and hung to dry. Here's another impossible choice. Hang them inside where they'd take days to dry in humid summer air or cold winter temperatures, or hang them outside where they'd dry faster, but announce to every passing neighbor, ranch hand, and stranger exactly what they were. Menstrual rags drying on a clothesline destroyed the careful fiction of female propriety that frontier society demanded. Many women hung them at night, took them down before dawn, or hid them among other laundry and prayed no one looked too closely. The disease pathway blood is a pathogen vector. 19th century frontier women didn't know about bacteria, but they understood infection empirically. They'd seen wounds fester. They'd watched childbed fever kill new mothers. They knew that blood and sickness traveled together, even if they couldn't name the mechanism. Washing menstrual rags in the same basin used for food preparation created a disease pathway that killed women with grim regularity. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread through fecal-oral contamination. And when you're washing blood-soaked rags in water you'll later use to rinse vegetables, when you're scrubbing those rags with hands you can't properly sanitize, when you're hanging them to dry in a one-room space where food is prepared and children sleep, the pathway is direct and deadly. Women who couldn't heat enough water to properly boil their rags simply washed them in cold water and hoped. The fabric never got truly clean. Blood proteins bonded to the fibers. The rags took on a permanent brownish tinge, a permanent smell. Women pressed these rags against their bodies month after month, introducing bacteria directly to mucous membranes. Vaginal infections were ubiquitous. Frontier doctors, almost exclusively male, had no understanding of female anatomy and recommended treatments that made everything worse. Vinegar douches, carbolic acid rinses, mercury solutions that caused tissue damage and poisoning. The infections led to fevers, to pelvic inflammatory disease, to infertility, to death. Maternal mortality rates reached 1 in 8 in some frontier regions, and while childbirth itself was dangerous, the infections that began with poor menstrual hygiene killed women long before they ever got pregnant. The shared water nightmare. The menstrual rag didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a larger hygiene ecosystem built on radical water scarcity. That same water shortage meant frontier families bathed in shared water, reused in a hierarchy that revealed everything about frontier gender and power dynamics. Saturday night, if the family was fortunate, meant bath night. A tin wash tub, maybe 3 feet across, placed in front of the stove. Water heated in kettles and pots, hauled from a well or creek that might be contaminated with runoff from the outhouse uphill. The father bathed first in clean, hot water. Then the mother, climbing into water already grayed by one person's dirt, sweat, and skin. Then the children in descending age order, each one entering water progressively cooler and filthier. By the time the youngest child bathed, the water was brown, cold, and left a ring of sediment in the tub. A menstruating woman bathed in this water. She washed blood from her thighs in water her children would use next. She had no choice. And after everyone had bathed, that water, filthy with a week's worth of accumulated sweat, dirt, menstrual blood, and whatever diseases the family carried, was thrown out the door, often near the kitchen garden, creating another disease vector. Most days, there was no bath. Women washed their faces, hands, and perhaps their feet if water allowed. The rest remained unwashed for weeks. Menstrual blood dried on their thighs. Sweat accumulated in the folds of 20 pounds of clothing they couldn't wash more than monthly. The smell in frontier cabins, confined spaces where multiple bodies lived, slept, cooked, menstruated, and nursed sick children, was documented by travelers as overwhelming. But frontier women had no alternative. Deodorant didn't exist. Frequent bathing was impossible. They endured, and they internalized the shame of their own bodies' odors as personal moral failures. The pregnancy trap. For married frontier women, menstruation was often brief. Pregnancy followed pregnancy with brutal regularity. 8, 10, 12 children over a woman's reproductive lifetime. And pregnancy brought its own hygiene nightmares that made menstrual rags seem almost manageable. Childbirth on the frontier occurred in dirt floor cabins with midwives who had no way to sterilize their hands or instruments. Postpartum bleeding lasted 4 to 6 weeks, requiring the same menstrual rags, the same washing routine, the same impossible privacy concerns, but now the woman was recovering from birth, possibly tearing, possibly infected, definitely exhausted. Changing and washing her postpartum rags while caring for a newborn, while cooking for the family, while managing the older children, while healing from childbirth itself, this was the reality that killed 1 in 8 frontier mothers. Infections that started with unwashed hands, with contaminated rags, with bacteria introduced during birth, became childbed fever. Frontier women watched their friends die from this fever, watched new mothers go from healthy to septic to dead in a matter of days. They knew the danger. They also knew they had no way to prevent it. They could boil their rags if they had fuel and strength. They could try to rest, though frontier economics made rest impossible. Mostly, they just hoped they'd be among the 7 who survived, rather than the 1 who didn't. The class and race divide. The menstrual rag as object also reveals frontier hierarchies of suffering. A wealthy woman in Denver or San Francisco, frontier cities with some infrastructure, might own cotton flannel rags specifically designated for menstruation. She might have a private bedroom where she could change them unseen. She might have a servant to wash them, transferring the bloody, intimate labor to someone else's hands. She might bathe weekly in a copper tub with store-bought soap. A homesteader woman had flour sacks and a tin basin. A ranch wife might have slightly better: cotton fabric from town, a larger family water allotment, but still no privacy, still backbreaking labor. A woman in a frontier brothel had the worst of all possible worlds: multiple clients daily, constant risk of pregnancy and disease, no time to properly wash between encounters, and menstruation that couldn't stop work. Prostitutes used vinegar douches, carbolic acid rinses, and mercury treatments trying to prevent pregnancy and disease. These treatments destroyed vaginal tissue, caused mercury poisoning, and led to infections that killed them before age 30. Chinese, Mexican, and black women faced additional barriers. Many frontier towns excluded them from public bathhouses. They were denied access to the cleanest water sources, forced to use contaminated downstream water. Racist stereotypes blamed them for disease outbreaks, even as white frontier communities' poor sanitation created the outbreaks. These women used the same flour sack rags, faced the same impossible water scarcity, but did so while fighting systems designed to deny them even basic resources. The silence that killed. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of the menstrual rag and everything it represented was the silence surrounding it. Menstruation was not discussed in polite frontier society. Medical texts ignored it. Newspapers never mentioned it. Male doctors refused to examine female patients beyond taking a pulse and observing symptoms from across the room. Women suffered infections, pain, hemorrhages, and complications in isolation because admitting you needed help meant admitting something shameful was happening to your body. Young girls learned about menstruation when it happened to them, sudden, terrifying bleeding with no explanation. Mothers whispered instructions about the rags but never explained why this was happening, what it meant, whether the pain was normal. Girls internalized that this was shameful, secret, something to hide. This silence meant infections went untreated, complications went undiagnosed, and suffering was normalized. The silence also meant solutions never developed. If female hygiene couldn't be discussed, it couldn't be improved. The first commercial sanitary pads weren't patented until the 1890s, and even then, they remained expensive and available only in cities. Frontier women continued using rags well into the 20th century because commercial products never reached them, and because the economics of frontier life made purchasing disposable items impossible. The true cost. The menstrual rag, this small, seemingly insignificant object made from repurposed fabric, ultimately represents the full cost of frontier expansion. That cost was paid in women's labor, hauling water, washing rags, making soap, managing hygiene for entire families with no resources. It was paid in women's health, infections, disease, death from complications that could have been prevented with clean water and basic sanitation. It was paid in women's dignity, forced to manage intimate bodily functions in shared spaces with no privacy, forced to internalize shame about normal biological processes. Historians have documented that frontier women aged faster than their Eastern counterparts. Photographs show women at 35 looking 60. Part of that was hard physical labor, exposure to elements, poor nutrition. But part was the constant grinding stress of managing impossible hygiene situations with inadequate resources, the mental load of rationing water, hiding menstrual evidence, washing rags in secret, managing infections, enduring shame. This load never lifted, and the frontier women who survived, who managed this impossible situation month after month, year after year, received no recognition. Their labor was invisible. History books documented the men who built railroads and fought wars, the women who kept those men alive through careful water management, who prevented disease through obsessive washing despite resource scarcity, who birthed the next generation in unsanitary conditions, and somehow kept most of them alive. These women disappeared from the historical record. The menstrual rag disappeared with them, literally burned or buried, and metaphorically erased from frontier narratives that preferred romantic myths to bloody reality. So next time you unwrap a disposable pad or insert a tampon or turn on your shower without thinking about water scarcity or wash your hands with antibacterial soap after using a private bathroom, remember the frontier woman with her flour sack rags. Remember that she had none of these conveniences. Remember that her monthly cycle was a crisis of labor, privacy, and disease prevention that she managed alone in silence, with resources that wouldn't fill a single modern bathroom drawer. This isn't ancient history. The last frontier homesteaders lived into the 1960s. There are women alive today whose grandmothers used these rags. And globally, billions of women still lack access to clean water, commercial menstrual products, and private sanitation. The frontier wasn't an aberration, it was just honest about the conditions that many women still endure. If this historical reality shocked you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more brutal truths about the American frontier that history books sanitized beyond recognition. And drop a comment. What surprised you most about frontier women's hygiene realities? Was it the shared bathwater, the reusable menstrual rags washed in cooking basins, or the complete absence of privacy? Let me know, because this is just one corner of frontier women's lives that history erased. There's so much more to uncover.